I just remembered to record. I don't know if they're going to be able to catch this reading, but that's the hope. And and to the people in our group who can't be here today, that's what I was meaning to say. But also some of the former writers and memoirists who are here, people who have done their stint in the memoir writing group. We have Larry and Anita, and we have Stan and Sharon and Ted. Yeah, quite a few. And just by way of explanation, what we do in our memoir group, all of you are experts. And it's important to remember that, especially as we age, and to consider what our area of expertise is. And I'm not just talking about the work you do or did, I'm talking about your experience in the world, particularly in the world of relationships, but not just that. Some of you have raised a child single-handedly. That makes you an expert on raising a child single-handedly. Some of you have cared for an elderly person. That makes you an expert in caring for an elderly person. Some of you have gardens, and that makes you a garden expert. And memoir is not just telling the story of that experience, but it's what we learned as we went through it, what we learned. And it's that learning that we want to share in our memoirs. Now, having said that, the people who are reading today, Crystal, Phoenix, Rochelle, Tara, and Julia, won't be getting around to the learning bits of their memoir because they just have 5 minutes. I ask that you respectfully listen to the very end, and that I'm really proud that they're here. I don't think I need to say they are going to just come up in the order that they were listed, and they will introduce themselves. So thank you very much and enjoy.
Here I am, I'm Crystal Hansen. Hi. A lot of you are very familiar faces, so those of you who are new, hi, I'm Crystal. So these stories are from my grandfather's farm in the Peace River district. So every summer as a teenager, I was allowed to visit grandfather's dairy farm. My teenage cousin Harold often visited at the same time. We explored around the farm and completed chores asked of us. We fed grain to the chickens, kitchen waste to the pigs. We herded cows to pastures in the morning and herded them back to be milked. The journey offered a bubbling brook where we splashed in the shallows, and sometimes we strung willow twigs with twine and wire hooks with worms to try and catch trout. One sparkling hot summer day, Granddad gave us a ride on his tractor. We begged until he gave us turns to drive the machine. He drove off to finish his tasks as we ran past the old Model T parked in the driveway. Excitedly, Harold said, "There's still a key in the ignition. Let's take a ride." So off we drove down a bumpy track to the main road. Harold was pumping the brakes furiously. "It won't stop. What do we do now?" he asked. "Look, there's a large cow eating grass in the ditch. Maybe her bulk can stop us," I yelled back. So we bumped against the cow. It stopped the car. The cow bellowed all the way to the barn as we sedately turned up the track and reparked the Model T. Grandfather found out, however. "What did you two do?" he yelled. Because the cow wouldn't give milk and sported a black bruise on its flank. So we had to own up. Our penance was to muck out the car barn and replace fresh hay on the floors. We did this grudgingly, but dutifully. And as the cows came into the stall that evening, we escaped to the house to relax with a long, cold drink of cow's milk. So when Harold was not present on the farm, my daily chore was to bring the dairy herd in from the fields. They had cow bells around their necks so that you could be hearing them from far away. When the wind blew, it distorted sounds and I couldn't find them. One day, Granddad came to help. They were waiting patiently by the field gate. That's the last straw, I thought, as I marched to the neighboring farm where they had puppies to give away. I brought a cute puppy home and asked if I could keep him to help herding with the cows. It was okay with him as long as I was the one to take care of him. The puppy followed me to the fields. I trained him by pretending to be a dog. We barked and rounded up the cows to bring them to the barn every night. He was so clever that if I stayed behind by the stream and said, "Bring the cows to me," he did. Sadly, I had to leave the puppy in Granddad's care, as our city apartment didn't allow pets. But there were many attractions at Grandfather's farm. Pete and Sally were Granddad's workhorses. When he bought the tractor, the horses were put out to pasture. I was given permission to ride Pete to the gelding, and I was learning to ride bareback. Pete gave me no trouble until the day we got close to the freeway. He took exception to the traffic noise and he bucked me off. I was splayed in the ditch trying to catch my breath. Am I dead? I thought, when I couldn't breathe. As I finally breathed normally, I watched Pete as he bucked and snorted and farted around the corner to home. Later, when Granddad saw I was okay, he laughed at my story. I continued to ride Pete during my summer visits. I learned that when you fall, you get right back up. And perhaps that was a life lesson learned.
In Phoenix, also known as B, known to the government as someone else. This is an excerpt from a story I wrote a few years ago about my grandfather that we working at lately. I remember my grandfather, that fierce old man. He was one of those domineering, intimidating men who mellow and gentle with age. When I knew him, his blue eyes held sparkle and light, yet always he carried with him the shadow of his younger self. He fascinated me, like some wild creature caught by a lightning flash, who skitters into darkness and is gone. People talked about him, some with awe, some with humor, some with a contempt that hinted at knowledge I did not have. Yet they loved him, even against their wills. When I was a young man, my father told me, I hated my father bitterly, but by the time he died, he had no more devoted son than I. By that time, my grandfather was dead, and I'd heard the tales told in undertones by aunts and uncles shamed by a past they could not relate to the gentle old man they loved. The stories frightened me, hinting of dark wells and hidden pockets filled with hurt and betrayal and something I did not then call evil. I came to know my grandfather well when I was 8 years old. My parents had separated, and for reasons I don't know, my mother took her children and fled 300 miles to northern BC, where my father's parents lived. Perhaps it was because her own parents lived too close to my father and his new lover, my mother's former best friend, and the cause of the breakup, people said. So we moved in with my grandparents. That was a confusing time for the child I was. Everything was in flux, and mysterious undercurrents threatened to snatch me and whisk me into a looming darkness. My grandmother was still alive then. The cancer might have started to grow already. It was only a year later she died, an event which rocked that large family tree to its roots. Looking back, it's easy to paint in omens and foreshadowings. One thing I know, As an 8-year-old, I saw my grandmother as a background figure, not quite a person, not to be loved. It does not matter if I saw it as her impending death or not. What matters is that my grandmother was a wraith and my mother was in fragments, so I attached my heart and my longing for recognition to my grandfather. It was he upon whose knee I bounced, giggling, he whose jokes cracked me up, he whom I begged for piggyback rides, and it was he who frightened me with tales of scalpings by the Indians who lived on the reservation 2 miles away. Be good, or I'll sell you to the Indians. He would offhandedly repeat until it became a litany, a ritualistic phrase fraught with tension. Then he tapped the top of his head, nodding sagely. See my bald spot here? That's where they scalped me when I was your age. This was guaranteed to produce a prickle in my own scalp as my body anticipated the bloody moment when painted savages waved my long tangled locks triumphantly aloft. I loved it with that painfully morbid glee which keeps children coming back for more even when tickled to the point of wetting themselves. We used to fill our water jugs down at the reservation pump. One day, a large jovial man who I later learned was the chief looked straight at me. I liked him, so I smiled. You're Lloyd Ray's granddaughter, aren't you? Yes, I said. He nodded approvingly. Yeah, Lloyd Ray, he's a good white man. I sensed benediction in his words. I wondered if he knew about my grandfather's bald spot. What he would think if he did. Yes, my grandfather was a dangerous man. He carried himself with a hunter's easy grace. He was born in 1889 on an Indian reservation in Montana, though he himself had no native blood, and he married a mostly white woman, my grandmother. His stories crossed the line from morbid fascination to stomach-wrenching terror when I was compelled to ride my bike through the dozen or so rundown shacks up on the reservation, that being the only route to town back then. My grandfather was God to me in those days. In this, he replaced my father, who had vanished from his place. At 8, I demanded a God with physical presence, one I could touch and see and hear. My grandfather had a presence larger than life, bigger than the sun, very much like my Leo son father. He satisfied my worshipful need fully. It did not disturb me then, the offhanded cruelty with which he treated my grandmother. I gave it no thought. She was nothing to me. No, that's not true. For she cooked delicious things and patiently let me help. And she made me lovely handcrafted doll furniture for my birthday that year. She was something to me. But with a child's cruel self-interest, I was quick to dismiss her from my heart whenever my grandfather dashed her upon the rocks of his abysmal contempt.
I'm Rochelle. These are excerpts from a collection I'm working on. Part 1 is about my grandmother. Part 2 is about a novitiate nun taking her vows. The stairwell of her duplex near the Gatineau River in Hull always smelled like boiled onions and meat. But as soon as you walked in the door of my grandmother's apartment, all you could smell was rose palmolive soap. Her home was immaculate. Plastic flowers in permanent bloom were tucked into shrines everywhere. My favorite was the shallow vaulted nook in the hallway. That one had a pink and blue Virgin Mary nightlight and a small prayer card of the levitating Saint Teresa of Avila taped to the side of the black rotary telephone. Centered on the wall over the kitchen table was a framed picture of a fair-haired Jesus of Nazareth. He had beautiful blue eyes. Just looking at his sad face inspired prayer. Sometimes when we all sat in the living room together, my grandmother would rock gently from side to side, and her rosary would drop into use. The cross at the end of the faceted beads would slide down between her fingers, and she would absent-mindedly polish the little silver body of Christ with the soft tip of her thumb. Her lips would move a tiny bit, and I knew that she was praying. On the drive back home to Montreal, I would sit in the corner of the back seat of a Plymouth Valiant, put my hands together under my snowsuit, and pray to the Virgin Mary and also to Saint Teresa, while picking up both my feet off the car floor to practice levitating. Sister Marguerite Andre welcomed us at the church doors. The flower girls wore white lace crinoline dresses and veils, white shoes and gloves. The ancient nun gave each of us a modest bouquet of white flowers, while another equally ancient, though less kind-looking nun presented us with a blue satin box containing a silver wedding band. We were then paired with novitiate nuns and led into the vaulted chapel. My nun was Sister Marie Joseph. She was getting married to Jesus, and I was her flower girl. The ceremony began. We walked towards the altar in procession, and I breathed in church smells of frankincense, old wood, and candle wax. The novitiates turned left and right, aligning themselves before the massive golden altar. Each flower girl stood beside their nun, waiting for instructions from the priest, who unexpectedly began to sing chants and amen and Jesu Christo and nomine Patris et Filii Spiritus Sancti, and more chanting and more praying, and my throat began to swell with their voices. Sister Marie Joseph rose and knelt in prayer, and I rose and knelt with her. Fragrant smoke from swinging incense burners ascended to the heavens. Pale blue spirals dissolved into sunbeams, streaming into the church from above. It was miraculous. Then communion came. The body of Christ in the thinnest wafer was placed upon my tongue. After all the novitiates and flower girls had received the Holy Eucharist, the priest motioned for the rings to be given. I presented the opened silk box to Sister Marie Joseph. After sliding the band onto her own right finger, she joined her pale, dry hands together at her heart in prayer. Returning to the pews, the flower girls watched the newly betrothed nuns lower themselves to the ground in supplication. Sister Marie Joseph lowered herself, first kneeling, then face down, forehead against the stone, arms spread like wings embracing the ground before the altar. I was transfixed in rapture and felt my whole body lighten, and then, ever so slightly, release from the hold of the stone floor.
And now for something completely different. This writing is a writing in progress, and it's something that I'm doing to help me heal. And I'm asking you to help me heal while I read this. Very short, and it came about from a prompt that we were prompted to write, I don't want to tell you, ... I'm terrible. Right? I don't want to tell you that my one and only child is a drug addict living on the streets in the downtown east side. And every time I go see her, I'm afraid of what I'll find in the stench and hostility that she lives. I don't want to tell you that I've seen the darkness and my heart is breaking. Can you feel my heartbeat? I don't want to tell you that I hurt in a place I can't even find. I don't want to tell you that when I hold her in my arms, I still believe that this is all she needs until the ugly drags her away. I don't want to tell you how funny she is, clever and kind, as I watch her suffocate in her own reality. Can you hear me breathing? I don't want to tell you that I'm always listening for a whisper of hope. Sometimes a little bit of faith goes a long way. I don't want to tell you that I cry without tears. Can you see me weeping? Sometimes it's better to say nothing at all. I don't want to tell you any of this.
Hello. Check this out. Oh, that's really beautiful, Tara. Hello, my name is Julia Tashini Rossignol. Peaches pink and ripe, sunset glows on waves, hot July summer, bursting with sweetness, childhood delight, summer in Niagara. With war raging in Ukraine, I can't help being reminded of family stories I've heard over the years. My parents escaped the Soviet occupation of Hungary after World War II. Their journey took them across Europe to Brazil and the Dominican Republic before finding refuge in Canada. A small farm near the town of Niagara on the Lake Ontario was where my parents finally settled and raised my brother, sister, and me. For most of the year, it was just the 5 of us living in a 3-bedroom bungalow perched on a cliff overlooking Lake Ontario. In the summer months, our home came alive with friends and relatives, recapturing the happy gatherings of pre-war times. To make room for my grandmother, Nagmami, her sister, Iluneni, and brother-in-law, Mukibachi, we ordered a prefab 2-bedroom cabin from the Eaton's catalog. The kit arrived, and the log cabin look-alike was quickly assembled. Our extended family was thus able to stay all summer. 10 to 15 of us were assembled around the dinner table every night, always outside along the wooden deck. Hungarian was the only language spoken as we shared food and laughter while watching the brilliant reds and pinks of sunsets on the lake. During the day, we spent time doing all kinds of activities. I had a special fondness for my great aunt Iluneni. She was a brilliant needlework artist who, with swift and precise movements, could paint colorful bouquets of flowers on buttery linen fabric with needle and thread. Her skill was acquired through years of practice and dedication. My grandmother preferred to lounge in the sun and read paperback novels, their secret steamy titles hidden behind hand-quilted covers. From a young age, I was able to join in the ritual of preserving fruit. Together, we'd peel the thin skins from the juicy flesh of ripe freestone peaches with names like Baby Gold and Red Haven. We'd pack them in glass jars covered with sugary syrup and submerge them in a large enamel pot of boiling water. The humidity was intense. The resulting vacuum-sealed jars of sweet golden treasure were stored in our cool basement to be enjoyed throughout the winter. We all loved to swim in Lake Ontario. My mother enjoyed long swims, while my sister and I liked bobbing in the waves closer to shore. Sometimes we were mermaids with long green hair and tails made of scratchy pieces of matted plant fiber floating in the water. Soon enough, we began pelting handfuls of seaweed at each other, screaming in delight.
My brother and his friends built a fort in an old oak on the boundary between our farm and the next. To the south, you could see the Niagara Escarpment and endless acres of peaches. And to the north, across the lake, the Toronto skyline was clearly visible. We collected rotten fruit for a booby trap first, and made from some old rope and a wooden bushel. And we put the basket up to repel the imagined invaders. The best days were when my mom pulled out her old recipe book, written by hand with a fountain pen, ink blots and oil stains and all. She laughed as she told us how during the war, when supplies were scarce, she read recipes out loud as if each one was a chapter in a romance novel. Our small peach farm included a few cherry trees as well. Raytesh, or strudel, as most people would know it, was one of our favorites. We picked and then pitted the cherries. My mother prepared the dough in the largest Pyrex bowl of the nesting set. A thick linen cloth was laid on a round table and sprinkled with flour. We dipped our hands in melted butter and stood in a circle, pulling the dough carefully till it was almost paper thin. We worked slowly in time with each other, trying hard not to make holes in the pastry. Next came the layers of fruit, sugar, melted butter, ground walnuts, and cinnamon. And we carefully rolled the delicate confection till it looked like a boa constrictor. Into the pan it went, more melted butter on top. And then it was ready for the oven. While we worked, I loved to hear the story of Iluneni's narrow escape. It happened in the last year of the war in Schopflin. It's right near the Austrian border. Ilu was in the kitchen making pasta when she heard the menacing whistle of a bomb falling nearby. She jumped into a pantry cupboard just in time to narrowly avoid shards from blown out windows, emerging without a scratch, seeing thousands of tiny daggers of glass stuck in the heavy wooden doors of her hiding place. But all she could think of was how the bowl of flour and eggs was ruined. There would be no pasta that night. To this day, I cannot crack an egg without thinking of my aunt's near miss and my good fortune to have lived a life without war. I'll always treasure my summers of pastries and swimming, embroidered flowers, sunset dinners by the lake, and the loving sounds of my elders talking and laughing in Hungarian.
Thank you very much, tall people, for that beautiful, beautiful reading. They've worked very, 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 very hard this year. I'm extremely proud of them. I just have one announcement. Next week, Thursday, if you want to repeat this experience, we are having a reading at Tiamat, thanks to Judith Lawrence. And there's going to be fewer people, but it will still be very interesting. And it starts at 2:30 to 4. And there's a poster on Facebook if you want more information. Thank you very much for being such an attentive listener. Ted?
You have to say something about the policies, protocols around the.
It's on this from the page.
Okay, thanks very much for your attention. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Cornelia, and all the people who read. It was fascinating. It's one of the courses that are offered by New Horizons. So if you become a member of New Horizons and you want to